So that sort of question of trusting the data, I think sometimes people call it torturing the data, I think that's very appropriate. We should be asking those questions, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to see a machine or a black box as somehow, a better answer because, someone told you there's an algorithm and God forbid they said it was artificial intelligence, then we all have to bow down, or machine learning or something like that. You gotta know and understand what's under the hood a bit.
Welcome to How I Made It in Marketing from Marketing Sherpa. We scour pitches from hundreds of creative leaders and uncover specific examples. Not just trending ideas or buzzword-laden schmaltz. Real-world examples to help you transform yourself as a marketer. Now, here's your host, the Senior Director of Content and Marketing at Marketing Sherpa, Daniel Burstein, to tell you about today's guest.
Look, I'll admit it. Given a choice, I would prefer to avoid math and data. I didn't get into marketing because I was passionate about spreadsheets. I got into marketing because I love to write and create, to make things. Hence the name of this podcast, right? At the same time, after a career in marketing, I'm a skeptic. I want evidence, which often comes in the form of data. And that is the challenge of marketing today, folks. For you, for me, how can those with a creative heart still tap into the evidence that data provides? So I was excited to see the pedigree of our next guest in his application to be a guest on How I Made It in Marketing. He was a man of the theater, and yet his application was filled with words like data-driven and deep statistical analysis of large data sets. So I can't wait to see what we can learn from our next guest's stories. Joining me now is Michael Diamond, Academic Director and Clinical Associate Professor in Integrated Marketing and Communications at the NYU School of Professional Studies. Thanks for joining us, Michael.
Daniel, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
This is going to be a lot of fun. So let's first look at your background real quick at a high level so people know who they're hearing. A former Senior Vice President and Acting Chief Marketing Officer for Time Warner Cable, where you led marketing for its $19 billion residential business. Earlier in your career, you were a strategy consultant for Booz Allen Hamilton, and right now you are a lecturer at the Yale School of Drama, which sounds interesting, again, your theater side, but mainly the academic director and clinical assistant professor in integrated marketing and communications at the NYU School of Professional Studies, where you support more than 1,000 grad students and 200 faculty. So we've had a lot of people on here with titles like CMO. We have not had a lot of academic directors and clinical assistant professors. So what does that mean, Michael? What do you do?
Well, I think of the job of the academic director as sort of a mixture between the chair of a department, which would be a classic, academic title, and a brand manager or a general manager, of a product. So at the School of Professional Studies at NYU, which has historically really trained, emerging professionals for different careers, there are different disciplines, and I manage the portfolio of programs in marketing and PR, the graduate programs in marketing and PR, and some certificate programs. So the academic director has to make sure that, the quality of the programming is excellent, that we're keeping the courses fresh, that we're getting great speakers in, and we're working with great partners, and we're recruiting high quality students. So, it's got this academic element to it and a sort of business development element to it as well. So
I like that. So those are your product lines or your lines of business. And I hadn't really thought of an academic that way, but that's interesting. All right, well, let's start by talking about some of the things you made in marketing. Like I always say, I've never been like a podiatrist or an accountant or an actuary, but I do feel like as marketers, we're unique that we make things. We walk away from having made things. So let's start with the first lesson from something you made. You said build capabilities that endure and not just quick fixes to near-term problems. So how did you learn this lesson?
Right. Well, the majority of my career in marketing, the start of my career in marketing was largely from the strategy, research, insights, analytics side, and then as I grew, I got promoted into growth marketing and ultimately in the role of the CMO, and we'll talk a bit more about that sort of more traditional creative side and campaign side, but. When I was running strategy and insights, one of the things that I was most proud of was building what's called a strategic segmentation scheme. And it sounds a bit geeky to say I'm proud of that, but the lesson, to cut to the summary, the lesson from that was, it was far more important to build enduring capabilities, things that people could use, that they could leverage, that could make them smarter or do their job faster or get them more insight, than it was to sort of generate quick hit insights for people. So instead of just trying to serve people by answering a question, we really wanted to build more of a corporate capability around segmentation and targeting, etc. And, it was a very engaged, broad, big project. We passed 30 million households. So we had data on, good data on 50% of them and great data from our partners on the other 50% of them. And we did lots of ethnography and qualitative research on top of all of the quantitative research. And at the end of the day, we built something which amazingly, a customer service rep could use if they needed to figure out how to upsell or cross-sell. Our M&A guys and gals could use if they were researching a new cable system or a geography to go into. The product development teams were able to use it to think through, what the next product portfolio looked like and who the target customer or how to serve the target customer. So that was very rewarding for me, to go, I guess, to go broad and to go deep, and build something that lasted.
Yeah. So, and let me ask you too, because what I like you're saying, it almost sounds like you're thinking about the value proposition of it going in. So, working with data people, I mean, there are some great ones, but as an example, I'd work with, I volunteered with these grad students who are doing data science for social good. And it's great, students, you see it very pure and they're such smart data people. But then you'd go in and you'd see it more often of, they'd pull these data points and be like, well, okay, but why does that matter? You know what I mean? What is the value in that?
Yeah.
Getting to the value proposition of what you're delivering. So I think you were mentioning at Time Warner Cable, this is the point where things were shifting toward the bundling of services like video, internet, and phone. So what triggered this? Like, what gave you the idea, okay, this is something we need to build to create value? Was it this shift in consumers?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And, just a quick comment on what you said before, Daniel. I think when we started the project with strategic segmentation, and I could say, we partnered with a wonderful chap called Stephen Goldbach, who was at Monitor at the time and now is the head of strategy at Deloitte, and one of the things he talked to us about and we kept in mind all the time was this sort of balance between insight and actionability. And I think a lot of, projects that analytical people or qualitative researchers can do could deliver enormous amounts of insight, but may lack a certain amount of actionability. So, my whole life, and I'm sure we'll come back to this, is about trying to find what I call the actionable insight and encouraging teams to build actionable insights. So we did. I think we were very explicit about that. And just to sort of geek out slightly more, which will answer your question, Daniel. And I'm an English major, by the way, as well. So math was something I learned sort of to love and enjoy. But my first passion is English and theatre and things like that. But one of the things we also decided early on with segmentation schemes is you have to develop what they call the dependent variable, or put less pretentiously as the business objective. So you don't just build these segmentation schemes for the fun of it, to sound nice. You build them because you've got some business objective. You're trying to figure out how do various groups of people vary with respect to something, yes? And in our case, exactly as you identified, it was with respect to bundling, yes? So we were beginning to emerge into that era where you could buy your it was slightly before the cell phone services that the cable companies went on to sell, but you could buy telephone, you could buy video, you could buy internet connection, obviously, and some at that time were buying one from the cable company, one from the telephone company, one from somebody else, So the question for us was, how do we identify those consumers who had the highest propensity to some extent to bundle products and service with us, and or better understand those who maybe didn't want phone but wanted the other two products. So it did come out of that need and an understanding that, the digital, our connected life was becoming so significant, and we as a cable company were able to service so much of that. We really wanted to make sure we understood all of the dimensions of that and what drove consumers' purchasing habits, but more fundamentally what their needs were, their attitudes and their beliefs, all the good marketing stuff that you can put into campaigns, but everything from campaigns to pricing, you can really work it. So
Yeah, so if you're listening now and you're like, hey, look, I don't have 30 million data sets. I'm a small company. I can't bundle big things like phone and customer and voice. I'll tell you just one quick example from us. We found that we bundled our content at one point. We have, because, we have Marketing Sherpa, Marketing Experiments, Mech Labs. We have B2B Business Blog at that point. And we said, like, hey, people are receiving content individually through those streams. And we bundled them into something we call the Marketing Experiments Quarterly Research Journal. So I think there's a bigger lesson. I want to get into the data in a second, too. But there's a bigger lesson to understand your product mix, no matter what size of a company you have, and understand that, hey, you're serving a customer one way, like in the case of Time Warner Cable, it was cable. But if you're doing a good job servicing them that way, what are the other kind of corollary ways that you can serve those customers, right? I mean, we're talking about share a customer, right? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, and we talked, about share of wallet. I mean, it is, we spent a lot of time with colleagues at, really top class marketing companies like American Express, etc. And American Express has a very clear-eyed view about what, at least when I was doing the project, they used to call share of plastic spending. So share of plastic spending was an objective for them. So we thought about that, which is, there was a wallet, there was a budget that a household budget people spent on telecoms and internet connectivity and all those kind of things. And what might we do to, win more of that share, in a legitimate and, value additive way. And, it does, when you think about these things also, though, from the consumer level, you have to start, I think this is the challenge always, to be consumer led. You'll learn really interesting things about, we had a whole discussion about the notion of value, and value means very different things to different people. There were some people who absolutely could afford the products and services. So it wasn't a question of material wealth, or having the disposable income. It was just, they demanded good value for money. For other people, perhaps who are more limited budgets or constrained spending, it really did mean probably cheaper or less expensive options, at least. So there's a lot of nuance once you get down to the, with exactly the same product and service, at the end of the day, the same bits and bytes, arguably. But there's a lot of nuance when you get down to the consumer level, really understanding, their needs, attitudes, values, beliefs, etc. There's a host of things we studied. That allows you then to design products and services and price products and services and package products and services in different ways. And of course, influences advertising at the end of the day. So,
yeah, when you talk about that nuance, I was watching one of your talks and you use these two words. I've never heard them together before. And it just grabbed me. Data poetry. Right? Data poetry. I love it. I thought it was a perfect combination of your background. You got an MFA from Yale and theater administration. And if you can even if you're hearing Michael talk, even like we've had a lot of great podcast guests, but no one has been like as smooth as Michael so far. Got to see the accent's part of it for sure, but I can definitely tell that the theater training in there. But anyway, so, that's maybe the poetry part. And then bringing the data into there is you had a background at the London Business School and management marketing strategy. That's where your MBA is in. So where did you come up with that term data poetry, and what does it mean? Is that the nuance we're talking about here?
Yeah, well, I studied English as an undergrad at Oxford, and absolutely obsessed by language my whole life, especially the spoken word, and that was what got me into the theatre. I was a lousy actor, but I tried my best, and then I directed a few shows, and I really enjoyed that. And then I actually ended up managing theatre companies. So I love to be around the theatre, but I was probably most effective as a business person in the theatre, not on stage. But at the heart is a passion for language and the power of language, and what poetry does well. And I'm going to butcher this. I forget who said this. It will probably come back to me. Probably Coleridge or something. It was what oft was said, but ne'er so well expressed. Yeah. So oft was said, but ne'er so well expressed. So what do they mean? Basically, is poetry has this lovely way to, in a very compact and elegant way, to put information and impact into a sentence. And also give it beauty. And what I found when I was dealing with data is that the folks around me who were not trained in data or data science or particularly interested, you were much more powerful and effective if you could tell a story, a data visualization story, or a story that sort of almost attacked the emotions and got at the emotions in the way that poetry can kind of get under your skin. So that was the idea of data poetry, and more broadly, and I think you started to reference it, is the longer I've been in marketing and seen some of these, back and forth between is it data or is it Is it brand, or is it performance? Is it creativity, or is it technology? The more you realize it's both. It's got to be both. And so we, at NYU, where I'm teaching now, at the heart of what we teach is this notion that marketing is human-centered and data-driven. Yeah. And so I was trying to capture that a little bit in the idea of data poetry. Trying to balance those things, but also bring out the beauty. I think that talk came from a talk I was giving about data visualization, and data visualization obviously has that aesthetic quality as well, which which is, they're nice to look at, good data visualization. So that felt to me a little bit akin to poetry as well.
I like that. I'm going to use that. Well, let's talk about a lesson from the more human-centered side. You said tackle problems with integrity, self-reflection, and some humor. And as a creative, I just love the campaign that you had behind this. So tell us what you did as the acting CMO of Time Warner Cable, how you learned this lesson.
Yeah. Well, and like all efforts that, we described, they're done by teams, broad groups of wonderful people that we get to work with. And I would never put myself in as the sort of creative brand genius by any measure. I had wonderful, wonderful people in agency we worked with. But one of the things that was very clear to us, once I was acting chief marketing officer at the end and had sort of responsibilities more broadly than, research and insights and things like that, was as hard as we tried, and we really had, to develop new products and services and really wonderful, innovative, extraordinary services that leveraged in large part, I guess, the broadband infrastructure and, television on mobile devices. I think Time Warner Cable was probably the earliest or one of the earliest doing a whole host of these kind of things over IP. At the same time, it was probably fair to say we were still tackling some perception issues around service and reliability and all that. But ironically, we actually knew we had made significant investments in those things, and our numbers in those areas had increased, and we'd done well, and we're improving. But we had a sort of reputation. I guess today we would use the word reputation, that we had to deal with, and so we developed a series of campaigns that, for the first time, sort of made fun of ourselves and sort of acknowledged the problems honestly, and said, we're working on these things, but it also did it in a humorous way. And I think in some sense, it would be entirely wrong to say it was somehow my ethic or my that came through, but that was entirely consistent with the way I often feel about life. Is you have to be honest and own up and fess up, to things that you may have done wrong or a mistake you may have made, but you can also do that with humor and a good spirit. And I just think Time Warner Cable at the time was doing an amazing job of really honestly, reviewing, improving, communicating. I think we did a great job. And I believe the last year I was there was, one of our very best years. And shortly afterwards, all of our various CSAT scores, shifted significantly. So, that collective effort, and again, it's never one area, but I think between all the work we did in engineering and customer service and product development, and then on top of that to support it with marketing was, made a difference, and we did it in a certain way, I think.
Well, I'm a writer, I'm a creative. Pitch me one of the concepts. Come on, real quick though. You mentioned the improvement I saw in one of the articles written about it, 4.9% improvement in revenue that quarter. But come on, let's see your pitch, Michael. What was one of the concepts? Do you remember?
You may be really pushing me here for a bit, but one I remember was just this very, very cool dude who was, blissing out and dancing to the hold music. So this idea that, sometimes when you called in, you might be on hold for a very, very long time. Which I think is, more the stories, more the exception than the rule, clearly, but it was the things that would make the late night talk shows. And so we had some funny commercial with this chap listening to our hold music, bopping around and dancing around. And, it was, I think it was very, it was very one done. It was sincere, and it was humorous. And the chap playing that role was perfect casting, I think.
Good casting, yeah. Well, I think that a real lesson to learn here too is, I've been in so many value proposition workshops with business leaders, and there is a very big difference between value perception in the audience, in the potential customer, and the actual value that's being delivered. You know, so even though, Time Warner might have improved significantly in the value they're delivering, customers might still have the perception from several years ago. And that's why a campaign like that is so important in this situation where the company is making a transformation. But with any company, I mean, there's so many value proposition workshops I've been in where they're doing something behind the scenes or they're doing something, in a factory or in development or whatever, but nobody knows it. Right. I mean, that's the whole point of marketing, communicate that value.
Well, yeah. And I also think, there's a couple of old, adages there. One is about people remember not what you said or did, but how you made them feel. I think very often brand experiences or your interaction with a certain value proposition is ultimately about how it made you feel. What it and that's sort of what you remember a lot more, and that's probably even more true with service brands. Where so much of it is about human interaction. But the other element, and it kind of goes back to this question about data poetry. Is, and it's a quote I like a lot, and, again, not intending to sound pretentious, but there was a Roman orator, a guy called Cicero, many people read for his wisdom and everything. And one of the things he said that I absolutely love is he said, the effect is in the affect. And what he meant by that was essentially, if you can hit people at the emotional kind of heartfelt level, you're going to have a lot of impact. And so I do think that, a lot of marketing, I mean, obviously, I'm not saying anything new here. A lot of marketing has traditionally worked at that level to try and understand, how to move some levers around emotion and affect. The build I would give you, Daniel, these days, and I think it's a genuine conversation, is that we've moved probably as well from that to this broader idea. People talk about moving from value to values. So I think now the other element is a little bit more cognitive, which is about, okay, but what are you doing for the world, and how do you show up in the world as a brand, and what's your purpose, perhaps social purpose. And again, many of those things are also affect related, because you want to feel good about yourself for using or buying a brand, but they are also a little bit more cognitive. I think people are thinking about, what is this brand, not quite just how does this brand make me feel, but also what is this brand or this company doing in the world. And so that's a new, I'm sure it's not new, but that's a thing that a lot of us are thinking about, and we're trying to educate students to be more aware of that as they think about their practice as marketers and PR people.
Very, very true. And so if you're hearing this and you think, well, this is very B2C, I think we've got really a great B2B example coming up of how you did something not exactly the same, but kind of also made sure you changed the both value perception, actual value delivered, and maybe even values of a B2B event. So you said the lesson was trust yourself and your instincts, especially when you feel passionate about something, which ties into values very well.
Yeah.
So tell me, what changes did you make at this B2B event?
Well, actually, you set it up in a really nice way, Daniel, and in a way perhaps I hadn't thought about before, which is, so the anybody who's listening who spent some time in cable television, on the programming or the network side or the system side, will be familiar with an organization called CTAM, and it's a wonderful organization. It's basically the cable marketing group. And I tried to participate as much as I could when I was running insights and research, and certainly later as well. But and I would go to what was called the research conference each year. And, it was a wonderful conference, but my question at the time was, it felt a little bit like we were talking to ourselves, so a lot of, cable research people or TV research people would be there. And I also felt at some level, and maybe it was because I'd sort of just taken on this role, and it may have been candidly to do with my own ego, I felt like, well, we're more than just research, First of all, we're insights, and so we talked to the leadership at CTAM about rebranding the conference. And I had two wonderful colleagues with me working on that from ESPN and I think Viacom Networks. I'm blanking for a moment on the second, but so the three of us sort of decided we would rebrand at least to Insights, and then the second thing I think was to this idea that we wanted to sort of elevate the role of Insights themselves and make this a conference that not just researchers would come to, or the CMO would say, yeah, well, why don't I send my VP of growth marketing or, my VP of brand marketing or something like that, that he or she would see this as not just a place where researchers are going to talk, but actually where actionable insights back to that topic were going to be generated. And then the third thought, none of these things actually answer your question quite yet, but the third thing, Daniel, is that I also had a sense, back to this idea that we shouldn't be talking to each other, that we should bring people in. So we were able to bring in, wonderful people like Dawn Hudson, who at that time was I think she just stepped down actually as the CMO of PepsiCo, or certainly the CEO, I can't remember, but she was a wonderful help to us. She went on to be the CMO of the Ladies Professional Golf Association, just a wonderful individual. And but by pulling people like her in to have conversations with cable marketers, it felt to me it was going to be much more useful, to bring some of those FMCG, consumer packaged goods type thinking into our discussion. So there was sort of the three things we tried to do, shift from research to insights, elevate the role of insights to be more operational or business focused. And third was to bring in new voices. So, I had sort of thought this through before, and this is sort of starting to answer your question perhaps a little bit, which is, that was kind of my instinct, going in. But I wasn't quite sure it would work, or I wasn't quite sure everybody else would agree with me. And so it was a bit of a leap of faith to sort of, push on this and trust my instincts. And I felt like I was onto something. And as I said, I was very lucky to be to work with someone like Artie Bolgerin, who was a wonderful chap at ESPN, and others too, to make this thing a reality, and they shared that vision. But it was rewarding, to recognize. And then what happened actually was that the people cloned a lot of our content to use for other conferences and things like that. Actually, sort of more senior executive conferences, because they kind of got what we were doing. We even were one of those early conferences. I don't know if I may not be able to paint the word picture here for you, Daniel, but we had this fantastic, cartoonist at the back, and he was cartooning the whole time with what people were saying. So at the end, there was this wonderful huge scroll that went around the conference room, and we gave people copies of it to take home or whatever later. So we tried very hard to make this an event that was engaging, and the satisfaction ratings were off the roof, and the attendance was very strong as well. So, net, I felt like, I had a chance to articulate a vision, drive some change, work with great colleagues and deliver a very, hopefully memorable experience. So.
Let me dive in a little deeper, because you're saying this very eloquently. So I want to say this very non-eloquently and very directly to the audience, because you mentioned tackle problems with integrity, self-reflection, some humor. So I'm guessing... I'm sorry. You mentioned trust yourself and your instincts, especially when you feel passionate about something. So I'm guessing you were getting some pretty big pushback. And so what I hear, you're saying this very eloquently, what I hear is this was a pretty boring research conference with researchers, and we needed to expand it because we're the cable and television industry, and we're attracting marketers and advertisers, and we really needed insights into our audience. And so did you get some pushback from the other kind of more research-oriented, data-driven, hey, let's talk about statistical validity type of folks, or?
Well, I really probably wouldn't agree quite with your characterization of my words, Daniel, because and someone who loves research, I don't think the conference was boring necessarily. I actually really don't. I mean, certainly I loved going to the conference, but I think it had more potential. It just had an opportunity to play a bigger role, and that's so the pushback I think is usually that you get. I'm going to probably come down as your most pretentious interviewee this week, but I think
I was going for some of Cicero's affect when I said that. By the way, well, I was learning from you. But go on.
I'm going to match your Cicero, our CU, Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer was a philosopher, and one of the things he said is all truth arrives in three stages. And I try and remember the order. He said first it's resisted, then it's ridiculed, and then it's finally seen as self-evident. So, and I'll explain that. So this has been my experience throughout life. You try and do something new, and the first people say, oh no, you can't do that because, it's going to screw up the system, or that'll delay our ship date, or, we've never done it like that before. There's always a whole host of reasons, legitimate, at some level reasons, because someone said to me, all change requires somebody else to do something different. You know what I mean? Like someone someone has got to like, oh God, I got to do something different. So first it's resisted. Then what happens is when they see you persist, they'll say things like, oh, Michael with his clever ideas. And, it's just one of those things again, And then finally, once the thing is in place and it works, and everyone said, "Oh yeah, well, we all did that years ago. We've been doing that forever. That's nothing new." And to some extent, that's fine. If you know that that's going to be your experience walking in, I think that's fine. You just got to sort of not lose it at each of those different stages. And what I would say, I don't think it would be. I don't think it would be fair to say there was massive resistance to the change, but there were people who had already made the logos and the brochures or whatever it was, and they wanted some consistency in their lives, and people feel comfortable with the conversations they were having, But I think everybody ultimately embraced it quite quickly, and got on board, and we were able to elevate that community of researchers who was still, of course, the core. But it gave them a bit more standing. I think that's actually what's happened in the industry. The people who bring you insights are the people you should treasure. Those are ones you really, whether it's qual or quant, if you've got really high quality people in your institution or your groups that are developing really actionable insights, you want to nurture them and develop them. So I hope we achieve that without too much resistance.
Well, I think you did a great job of explaining what can happen when you try to change something on the front end. Anyone who's worked in change management can see that. But I think on the back end too, after the thing goes live, is then you get the feedback. And one thing, so we had a great podcast interview earlier with Nicole Salas. She's a CMO of Kitty Academy, and she talked about a campaign that they were running, a TV commercial campaign on PBS Kids, and she got this long handwritten letter from someone who just didn't like the music and just was tearing it apart. And so what I've done sometimes in my career is you hear that one loud voice and you're like, oh no, it's not good. But what she did, her and her agent, she framed the letter, they made memes out of it. And because what they realized rightly is, hey, we elicited a response. That's a positive thing. And so when we're talking about data, I don't want to get too deep. There's this idea of statistical validity and outliers, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're looking at actual data with a smart insights person, you can see that statistical validity and where there are outliers. But when you try to make a change or when you have a creative concept and you have one really loud voice, sometimes we overemphasize that voice, right? Sometimes we hear that loud voice and we're like, oh no, maybe we need to roll back this change.
Yeah.
Right? It's part of being a creative.
No, I think that's a super important point, Daniel. And if you don't mind me building on it a little bit, I think it's a couple of things. So I definitely agree. I think you just have to have common sense. But certainly, more statistically minded people will understand, that one loud voice could be an outlier in the data set and doesn't necessarily represent the data set. But at the same time, the qual side of me would say, lots of things. One, all complaints are a gift, which is the old, there's a book called that, And secondly, a lot of the study of innovation, as I'm sure you know, is actually looking at people who are outliers and understanding how they use your product, So you want to know about the chap in the basement who's hooked it up to 7 different other things and wired this in and that, because that might actually be an interesting product, So, I'm not a person who naturally resists outliers. I actually want to hear what they have to say because they may bring insight. And so, I think you have to sort of deal with that in moderation. What's dangerous, I think, is if decision makers in companies use like, well, the last person I spoke to said X, that's a bit dangerous, clearly. And the other thing that's often dangerous, and I don't want to disrespect anybody's instincts because there are some who have enormously good instincts, but when people start to talk about when you're talking about marketing campaigns, well, I like this and I like that, and that's a little challenging, because you are not the customer necessarily. Most CEOs are not the customers, directly of their products and services. So some humility. I think that goes back to your conversation, your point about humility. I think you need to have some humility that, however loud your thoughts are, they may not be representative. That's one way.
Well, I love too what you say about, I've written about that too before. I is one of the worst words in marketing. So, as a writer, it'll come up frequently. You get it, some like a long copy ad or a long copy sales letter, long copy brochure, and a designer will come back. No, I would never read this. I would never read this.
Right.
I even had one time I got the proof back from a printer, and I saw my copy just ended in the middle of a sentence, and I went to the art director and I said, "Oh, there's some mistake here." Whatever. He's like, "No, I just cut it off. It didn't fit." And I would never read that much. And it's like, who would read that much? Let's say I'm just using an example. A long copy ad for a refrigerator. You know who would read that much? Someone whose refrigerator broke and they're shopping for a refrigerator.
Exactly.
I wouldn't, and you wouldn't. Our fridges work. So that's a really good point to keep in mind. Okay, so when these things come up, right? So when you're passionate about something and when sometimes the leadership doesn't go with it, you have to, and this gets into our next lesson, speak truth to power. One of the most important yet most difficult things we can all do in any career. So we're going to shift now into some lessons from the people that Michael collaborated with, right? Because we as marketers, there's just two things we do. We build things and we build them with people. That collaboration is so important. So Michael, you were telling us about Don Logan, the co-COO of Time Warner, and he taught you to speak truth to power. How did Don do that?
Well, if any of you know Don Logan, and maybe many of your listeners were in the advertising industry and the magazine industry, and come across Don. Don was a very esteemed CEO of Time Inc. for I think 10 or 11 years, and had run Southern Progress before that. And he came over to in the various different sort of mergers that were going on with AOL and all of that sort of movement going on. He came over to be co-COO of Time Warner Inc. And his portfolio was to run all of the essentially subscription-based businesses, which included AOL, Time Inc. magazines, and the cable company. And then Jeff Bewkes at the time was the other co-COO, and he ran the studios and the music labels and the networks and things like that, HBO, of course. So and Don, when he came over, he and I had worked together before in different guises, and he asked me to be his chief of staff, which was absolutely thrilled to do. And early on, I remember one of the things I had to do was sort of work with him on a monthly and quarterly basis, looking at people's budgets and strategies, and and working with the CEOs and the CFOs of those companies to pull things together. And I think I put together a nice deck early on and was walking him through the numbers. And Don is just such an extraordinarily smart, smart man and intuitive businessman and very human, kind individual as well, but just a whip smart person. I think he literally is a rocket scientist. That's kind of what his graduate degree was in. And I could tell by the questions he was asking me about these numbers that he knew far more about the businesses than I did and possibly ever would. And I had as much to learn from him as I could possibly share with him. And I sort of said to him, I think I was like way too candid. I seem to remember I said something like, Don, I don't know if I'm going to be able to do this job, because, you're much smarter than me. You know all these things. You don't need me, And he said to me, and I thought it was a wonderful thing. He said, look, in a room of various people where everyone's going to have an agenda, I will know that you'll always be the person that will speak truth to power. That you will tell me straight, what you feel, what you see, what you know, what you hear, and things like that. And I said to him, well, that's a job I can do, because I felt very comfortable that I could do that job, And again, it wasn't to impose my opinion or to second guess anybody. It was just to say, I'll give you a fair assessment of what I see, and I will be comfortable saying, the truth, or at least as I perceived the truth. I wasn't going to hide anything or gild the lily, as they say, or anything like that. I just was going to, tell the truth. And I think that's an important role. I think it's very challenging for, young professionals, even perhaps more senior professionals to do that, because we all, have a mortgage and kids we want to put through college perhaps and things like that. So, you got to, and I also recognize that, and this is a lesson perhaps I learned later in life and would add to the idea, is that, it's not necessarily always important to be right. It's more important to be effective and have impact. So, I believe in speak truth to power, but I think, and I'm always evolving. I think you also have to moderate that with, okay, that's true, but also, how do you have impact and move things forward it's not just about being right, So that's a sort of a gloss on the idea of speak truth to power. But I think it's very important. I think if you're going to have a long career in any industry or company, you need to be known as somebody who was a straight shooter, not political, not saying one thing to one person, but being honest and open about what they see, hear, and believe.
Well, and I look at it from the opposite way too. I mean, what a great leadership lesson from Don for anyone listening now who manages anyone to be able to have that conversation with them and to validate them in that way and say, hey, here's what I need from you. And for them to do that. Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, that's a wonderful point. Yeah, I think that was sort of some of the aspect of Don I was trying to get to. I think he really was a very empathetic leader before we ever used the word empathetic, so...
Yeah, and to be able to speak truth to power, I was going to say, you need to be able to trust yourself, which is our next lesson. And I love that it came from the opposite direction. You learned it from Victoria Stapp, who was your executive assistant at Time Warner, right? So how did Victoria encourage you to trust yourself?
Well, Victoria is one of these wonderful colleagues, who we work with and collaborate with, but also have this capacity to just remind you of the important things in life. And Victoria or Vicky, she and I work very closely together. And I guess at some point in our chatting together about something, I had given her some counsel, a similar counsel about trust yourself. But one day I was definitely struggling. I think I'd just moved into a fancy new office, or I had some new position. And, I had to sort of try and figure out how to navigate all of the various trappings and new responsibilities and all sorts of things like that. And I came into work one day and there was this little rock with the words "trust yourself," just engraved on the rock, and it was just so empowering, and it really made me sort of pause and say, you know what, you've got this, not in an arrogant way, but just you actually have it within you, and you just got to trust yourself a little bit. So I've tried to pass that on, even to my kids. I think I gave the rock to my daughter at one point, So I have tried to sort of pass that wisdom on. But I think that was a very important lesson to learn from, somebody else who was looking in. I had similar counsel at one point, who someone said, it's a similar idea. They said, borrow my reality. Yeah, so it's this idea that, sometimes you just used the word validation earlier, and I think it's an element. You need sometimes a third party or someone outside of you to remind you, that, your instincts are good, or, the world doesn't look quite like you think it does, or, people's perception of you is not quite what you think it is. You need that kind of external validity. So I thought that was a very powerful lesson for me.
Yeah, I think that's great when it comes into the kind of those internal conversations. I think another way sometimes we don't trust ourselves is, so there's a lot of tools out there now. There's a lot of software out there that I've seen, especially AI-driven software, where it's just kind of like, hey, trust us. This thing works, and there's inputs, right, and magically it just kind of gives you the answer. And so, for example, we have a free digital marketing course. We have tools in there, but they're thought tools, because the idea is the marketers, they should trust themselves. Here's a framework, here's a methodology, here's a heuristic. Take these free thought tools and trust yourself and use it to figure it out, as opposed to, just what I worry about when I see some of those other tools out there. It's, what a good researcher would do is not understanding the methodology behind how it's giving you the answer, right? You're just supposed to trust some technology. Yeah. So as a researcher, I would think too, that kind of trust yourself comes in huge to be able to understand, or an insights man, if you'd prefer. Yeah. What methodology went in, and why can I trust this data when I'm presenting it and presenting it as an insight? Yeah, well,
trust is a huge word now. Obviously, I've been working a bit with Antonio Lucio, who you know probably well from his days at Facebook or Pepsi or Visa, and an extraordinary human being, another extraordinary human being, and his passion is about the idea of building trust, and how companies, really have to put trust at the center of a lot of what they're doing, partly because other institutions like governments, etc., are not necessarily delivering in ways that we need to sustain the climate or effect social change or whatever. There is a clearly new role for companies and by extension marketers. And shameless plug, that's kind of this new executive masters that we're launching in the fall is sort of around that. It's like how to help marketers think about things like these questions of trust and purpose, and integrate it with all the skills they have as marketers and PR professionals to become leaders. But this idea of trust is very critical for all of us today, and I think you're right as well, which is for anybody to put confidence in you or to trust you, the first thing is you need to deliver on your promises. Yes, I mean that's the simplest definition of trust, is to deliver on your promises. But the second, I think, is this element you were talking about, which is to it's almost what was the famous saying, trust but verify. You do need to also understand. I mean, we as consumers in this information rich, or some call it infobesity, there are I think it's okay to trust companies, or at least to say, and there are very many external ways to validate this now, that, they are making their best efforts to do X, Y, and Z. But you can also verify, and you've got to be intellectually curious, and you've got to be engaged, And I'm sort of mixing the role of a consumer and a marketer here, but, I think as a consumer that's true. But I think as a marketer, you always have to ask yourself, what is the quality and the nature of the information I'm receiving? What was the, and this is what scares data people, I think appropriately so, is, who is getting measured? And, I think we may talk about this a bit more, but, the great anxieties of legitimate anxieties of groups that look at a lot of data science and how it's being used today is because the data sets that are driving some of these decisions don't necessarily include people of color or enough women, or take into account regional differences, or any host of things, because the data just wasn't collected that way. And so that sort of question of trusting the data, I think sometimes people call it torturing the data, I think that's very appropriate. We should be asking those questions, and we shouldn't allow ourselves to see a machine or a black box as somehow a better answer because someone told you there's an algorithm, and God forbid they said it was artificial intelligence, then we all have to bow down, or machine learning or something like that. You gotta know and understand what's under the hood a bit.
Yeah, how does the thing work? But so getting to that trust, we have one more lesson, one final story, and I think this is really applicable to maybe some of the more entry-level people listening. So I know when I started as a copywriter, it's not like being a doctor where there's a residency or something, like where there's some official kind of path you have. I had an internship, but, one day I was a college student. The next day I was a copywriter in an ad agency, and people looked to me for answers. And it was the weirdest thing. You start as a student, all of a sudden, wait a minute, you're supposed to know things. And so it seems like earlier in your career, you had a similar experience from Janet Harris, the director of development at the Manhattan Theater Club. She told you, "We hired you because you are smart, you have our support, and we expect you can figure it out." So I think, was that another level of trust when you were starting out?
Yeah, I guess so. So my first career, I went straight from undergrad to grad school at Yale, and I studied in the theater, wonderful drama school there, and I studied theater management. And my first real job, I guess, was at Manhattan Theater Club in New York, a phenomenally well-run institution, run for years by a man called Barry Grove and Lynn Meadow, who was the artistic director. Just a wonderful place to be, frankly, as a young theater manager. And I worked with Janet Harris, who was the head of development. But when I walked in the door, I think I was so overwhelmed by all this talent that I just convinced myself, well, they had all the answers, and it was almost kind of like a test. Whether I could, we in academia we sometimes talk about guess what's in teacher's head. It's like, the instructor asks a question, and everyone in the class feels like, oh, I'm just trying to figure out what's in his or her head. And I felt that a little bit, like that somebody else knew the answers, and my job at that time was to organize all of what they called individual fundraising, so patrons and donors and all that sort of thing, and start some telemarketing campaign or tele-fundraising campaigns. And I remember at one point, just struggling with that and trying to come up with a solution to a problem. And I think I literally was in tears, talking to my boss and saying, I don't know if I got the answers, and I don't know if this is right or wrong or what you want. And, I was clearly a little overwhelmed. And she said to me, essentially it was a sort of trust yourself. She said, look, Michael, we hired you because you're smart. I'd actually interned with them for a little while, and so they knew me already. But, we hired you because you're smart. You have our support. Whatever you need is basically what they were saying is, if you need budget or, people or but it's your job to go figure it out and then come back to us with a recommendation. And it was extraordinarily empowering. It really was empowering, to be told it could have had the reverse effect, which it could perhaps have overwhelmed me even more, to feel there wasn't necessarily an answer. But it really was empowering because I felt it taught me something that I try to share with people, 30 plus years later, which is a lot of junior people in companies. And as you said, you may have listeners, who are just beginning in their careers. They always assume that the senior people have the answers, like someone up there has figured this out, and I can just tell you, and my career, whilst very rewarding and hopefully accomplished, is not, there's many other probably distinguished people you've had on your podcast, but the people at the top don't have it figured out either. They too are asking these questions. And what's more empowering is if you actually realize generally, they hired you because you're smart and perhaps you're young, or perhaps you come from a different industry, or perhaps you have a different perspective. Whatever reason it is, they hired you for you, and they're looking for you to come up with some of those answers. And so as soon as you can get through, I think, this moment of feeling like, well, someone else has the answer, it does two things. One is I think it stops you feeling, sort of sheepish about your own answers. Or, like, oh, well, my answer can't be worthy. The other thing is it actually tells you, I got to jump into gear and do something. Yes, because there isn't an answer I'm supposed to be following. I actually, my job is probably to figure out the answer, So, again, it's all nuanced. People have different jobs. I was super lucky in my career to have jobs which were, I guess, characterized more like knowledge management type jobs. So that, I guess, is what I was paid to do, to think and to develop new ideas. But it was a very powerful insight, that, yeah, you're here because we wanted you to be here. Your ideas are valid, and we don't have the answers. You figure it out. That was empowering, very empowering.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you say that. We talk about this imposter syndrome. I'm sure everyone's heard imposter syndrome. And it's a great quote. I'm probably going to butcher it, from Barack Obama, but he talks about, when he went from community organizer all the way up to president of the United States, it's the same jokers in the room. No one has the answer still. And that kind of really shocked him. And I felt that in my career. And I think that is, hopefully for the podcast listeners, that is one thing that has hopefully been helpful in this podcast. Michael, you're not the first person to bring this up. I was interviewing Aaron North, who is the CMO of Mint Mobile. And he was saying when he first started at Taco Bell earlier in his career, the scale there was so massive of everything they did. And so the impact of his decisions was so massive, kind of froze up at first before his boss told him, hey, trust your gut. We hired you for a reason. You're the guy that knows. That's the thing that surprised me. I like that you mentioned that. When I started early in my career as a copywriter, in the room, they would ask me and I'd look around like, okay, who knows the answer? I was like, oh, wait a minute. That's right. That's my job. I'm supposed to know the answer.
Yeah. No, I think that, the word gut just makes me think of one other thing, which is, and, I had a good opportunity when I was at Time Warner Inc., I think even, Time Warner Inc., to help the HR folks with training and leadership and development programs. And one of the things we used to talk a lot about was head, heart, and gut, And I think the combination of those three things is, and we may talk about this a bit later about, that's one of the things you think about as a leader is how do you balance the head, heart, and gut, and you need a little bit of each, passion, intellect, and instinct, perhaps. So.
Yeah, well, let's get to one more lesson. You said this was from Judith Harrison, EVP of Global Diversity, Equity, Inclusion at Weber Shandwick. It's not just the how and what of marketing and PR, but often who is in the room. So how did Judith teach you this?
Well, I've had the great privilege at NYU to work with an advisory council of wonderful, leaders in marketing and PR, including Judith. And, I've been an admirer of her work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. She led the various very big effort that the PRSA, so the Public Relations Society of America, led probably, I guess, 5 to 8 years ago around diversity and inclusion. So she's really just a wonderful presence and thought leader in this space, and someone I've had a privilege to sort of talk to. And we were in the heat of a conversation about what we're teaching at NYU. We think a lot about what programs we offer to our graduate students. In fact, I think we were actually talking about this new executive masters that I've mentioned, and how to put it together and what we were teaching. And she said, I think very smartly, but also don't forget who is in the room. Meaning, of course, that the modern marketing, modern PR discipline has to be as cognizant of the diversity of voices, and the way by which we create roles and create opportunities for people of color, for women, for LGBTQ, for veterans, for people with access issues, etc. It's just this. It's this reminder to all of us that you've got to think about who is in the room, whose voices are being heard, who's being seen, who's part of those decisions getting made, and how to enrich the conversation with more people, or more diversity of opinion, I guess, not just more people. And that was very powerful to me. I think I would hope that I knew this, but you always need to be reminded of it. Because it's so easy just to, obviously most of us kind of center our world from who we are and the privileges, and backgrounds and experiences we've enjoyed. But it's just so critical then to put, more voices in the room. And so I really appreciated her saying that. And it's very much a watchword of our program, both recruiting students, staffing, the speakers we have, the kind of partners and projects we work on. We really are trying to be as thoughtful and intentional about that as we can.
Yeah, and I like that. I mean, I hear the word room very broadly, and it is just something as content creators to think about. Yep. So, for example, when we create content, we put out a very broad net out there and ask people to come to us, because something that can happen as a content creator, if you just build relationships with certain folks, you just have a very insular look. So when we did the last blog post, which was just this real group blog post writing effort of, what was the final thing you would say in a blog post if you were about to die, or even with this podcast where it's very application based, I'd say, if anyone out there is a content creator, look at how are you finding the sources for your content and how can you open that up beyond just the, relationships,
Yeah.
Well, I know, Michael, you have to be getting off to an important meeting upstate. Let me ask one more question before I let you go, though. I think you've kind of hinted at this as we've gone through, but what are the key qualities of an effective marketer?
Well, I think I would start by saying intellectual curiosity. I've always felt, good marketers are just passionately interested in the world around them, and consumers and consumer behavior and product and design, and they don't have any limits. They're sort of sensing. They're out there, sense making, I think is sometimes the term used, but they're out there collecting all this thick data, thick description, really trying to be curious about the world around them, culture, things like that. So I think that number one is absolutely a sort of an intellectual curiosity. Number two would be a balance, and we've talked about this, between a human-centered view, a qualitative view, a creative view, whatever, and a data-driven or an analytical or a structured problem point of view. Sometimes they call it the poetry and the plumbing, or the math and the magic. Whatever you want to use as your frame of reference. But I think all modern marketers, and again, central part of what we teach at NYU, need to have that discipline. And I think the third thing, again, we've talked a little bit about this, is this idea that you either need to have a bias for action, which I think is an interesting way of articulating it, or at minimum, you need to be thinking about impact. So a lot of what we do, can feel rewarding and interesting, engaging, but at some level we have to measure the impact, not just the outputs and what activities we're working on, but really the impact. So I think marketers who are broadly intellectually curious, culturally curious around the whole ecosystem that surrounds them, that balance that sort of data side and that more creative side, and then who are always focused kind of on ultimately having impact, on top of perhaps some core leadership skills that we probably spent most of the time talking about. I think that's what I would look for, or I hope at least I've tried to develop in my own career. So let's put it that way.
I think it's great to see someone who has experience with research, who's an academic, to use that word impact, right? Because that's what sometimes we hear in education and research. It's not focused on the impact, the reality of actually putting it into action. So I love hearing you say that.
Well, Daniel, if I could jump in, I think that is the one thing, and this is, I'm like Cassandra in the wilderness here. I sit on lots of these lovely CMO councils. The ANA has been kind enough to invite me to CMO Growth Council. I go out to Cannes, I sit in all these meetings, and I'm sitting there as an academic now, or, and I use the word loosely, of course, but, I'm sitting there as someone who comes from academia, and everyone complains about the universities, and, they're not teaching that and not teaching this. And I think the reality is that it's not really true anymore, or at least I can only genuinely speak for NYU and the programs we teach at NYU, but we're entirely focused on impact. We're entirely focused on the practical application of X, Y, and Z. We're not teaching students to write book reports and do multiple choice quizzes and remember, how to define things. We're teaching students, or more important than helping them learn, which, is a important but subtle difference, helping them learn how to build a marketing plan, or, create an actionable insight, or generate a media plan, or, calculate customer lifetime value, or whatever it is. We're teaching them how to, build a competitive strategy, the things that they will need to do on a Monday morning. And I think that, the one thing I'd love to find a way to have that conversation, which is I think the gap is probably not as broad as people think it is between what's being taught in universities and what the industry needs. But obviously, if that gap is greater than I perceive, I'd love to have that conversation. But, that's certainly at the heart of what has made doing my job at NYU so wonderful, is to try and marry the practical experiences I've had and a sense of what I think might be useful to CMOs and potentially CCOs as well, whom we serve, and doing it in an academically rigorous way, in a pedagogical way. There's learning about how to teach people and how people learn, and we want to do it well. But I think that at least the project at NYU, across these different degrees that we offer and certificates that we offer, is really this applied professional education, in the real world.
Well, I think that ties together all the threads of our conversation nicely, right? Because on the one hand, is it the value perception versus actually value delivered challenge, like you talked about having at Time Warner? Or is it, hey, hearing these voices of these customers, are they outliers, or are these people I really need to learn from because there's, maybe something we're missing or some new product or way we can deliver value? So I think that's perfect. Yeah. I think it's funny how a career comes full circle. Go ahead.
Well, it's even the other theme you had touched on, which is the folks sometimes saying that in the room are really going back to their own experiences 10 to 15 years ago as students. So they're sort of saying, well, when I was a student, whereas, I think if you work with us, not us, but big us, academic education, you'll see that for many of these many of these groups, certainly the professional schools and the ones who are more oriented to this, we're really thinking about building capabilities and training emerging professionals in marketing and PR and what the industry might need, from those young folks, or you don't have to be young, wherever you are in your career, there are pivot points, and so that we're very focused on that, especially in the context of professional and executive degrees and executive training. So.
Well, I for one feel smarter after the hour we've spent together with Cicero and Schopenhauer. It's been very lovely, Michael. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Well, you're too kind, Daniel. It's a lot of fun, actually. I really enjoyed it, and I'm sorry I have to run, but it's really a wonderful experience.
Totally understand. And hey, thanks to everyone for listening to the How I Made It Marketing podcast. I hope you learned as much as I did.
Thank you for joining us for How I Made It in Marketing with Daniel Burstein. Now that you've gotten inspiration for transforming yourself as a marketer, get some ideas for your next marketing campaign from Marketing Sherpa's extensive library of free case studies at marketingsherpa.com. That's marketing, SHERPA.com.